All right, hey y'all, it's Miss Summers with your notes today on invasive species. Before we get started on this, a couple of announcements. Today is November 24th, the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Um, your test on this last unit, Unit 7, is going to be on December 4th. So that is obviously not this Friday because we won't be together because we'll be in our turkey comas, but it'll be the Friday after that. Okay, December 4th, Unit 7 test. That will bring us to the end of the semester, and our final exam will be December 10th. All right, make sure you read the announcement that I posted on Canvas last night with regards to the final exam. If you have any further questions about it after you read it, you're welcome to email me. All right, but Unit 7 exam December 4th, final exam December 10th. So let's look at invasive species. How do invasive species affect an ecosystem? So we need to know what they are, how they get to certain places, and then what kind of shenanigans do they cause. All right, so let's look at what it is first. An invasive species is a non-native species introduced to a new area. So when we say native, native species belong in a certain area. Non-natives are from somewhere else, okay? So like in this like little cartoon, we have this kind of seedy looking guy over here, this little perch fish, and all the other fish are like, oh no, oh no. All right, because this perch is going to cause some problems, all right, as invasive species tend to do. So why is it a thing? Why do certain, and these can be animals, but they can also be plants or funguses or whatever. Why do they end up in new areas? Why do they do that? All right. Well, it turns out a lot of them have to do with people, which is why we talk about it in this unit. People kind of do things, we do silly things for various reasons that can introduce an invasive species. So one of which is economic reasons. All right, if you watch, go through this PowerPoint later, there's a little video linked here to the cane toad. So a cane toad is a toad. It's an amphibian. And it is actually native to South America. And this toad, it's pretty good sized little froggy frog thing. But what's interesting about it is it actually produces toxins. It produces poison through its skin. So people in the 1920s and 30s, they had the brilliant idea in Australia. They're like, hey, we have these beetles that are destroying the sugarcane crop. So they're like, well, let's bring in the cane toad because the cane toad eats cane beetles. And they're like, it's brilliant, LOL. But it turns out it didn't do that at all because the cane toads and the cane beetles weren't ever in the same place at the same time. And then the cane toads started eating everything else. And it was a hot mess. Cane toad. Look it up. All right. Some species are introduced because people think they look pretty, ornamental. So kudzu, bamboo, a lot of different types of flowers or trees don't actually belong in places that they're at now because people put them there because they think they look nice. And then sometimes it can be on accident. People unknowingly transport species through trade, cargo ships, whatever, and they end up getting in places where they're not supposed to be. A final example of this, fire ants. So you probably, if you've lived in North Carolina for any amount of time, you've probably experienced fire ants or seen them, hopefully not too closely. But fire ants are not native to North America. They're native to Central and South America. And they were introduced like 60 years ago around Louisiana, around New Orleans, where there's a lot of ports and a lot of shipping going on, a lot of trade, and fire ants happen to catch a ride, and now they're here. All right. Other bizarre reasons I like talking about these because I like the stories. The European Starling, this is this little pretty purple greenish looking bird thingy. This bird is native to Europe. It was only introduced to the United States because one guy who happened to have a lot of money and who also happened to like Shakespeare, he decided that every bird mentioned in a Shakespeare work needed to be in the United States. So he bought a flock of these birds. He bought like 100 of them, and he let them go in Central Park in New York City. Well, 100 years later, there's literally hundreds of millions of them. And you might be like, well, what's the big deal? Like, it's just a little bird, right? Like, look at this little thing. It's kind of cute, right? The problem is these birdie birds actually compete for nest space, like with other birdie birds. And they will actually kick out birds from their own nest, like from the other bird's nest, and like take over. So it's really harming the native bird population. Another one, pythons, reptiles in general, um, but especially Burmese pythons, excuse me. These have been imported as pets in the United States through the exotic pet trade. And what people don't realize is when you get like a reptile, especially a big one like a snake, they have very long lifespans. They can live for 20, 30, 40 years. So when you get one, it's a lifetime commitment. So they get them as little babies, and they're like, okay, this is easy. I can take care of this. But eventually they get to be, 8, 9, 10, 12 feet long. And now all of a sudden they're very dangerous or they're very hard to take care of. So they're like, well, I'll just let it go in the wild and it can live out its life. Problem, you get a small number of these, they start to overtake an area. Okay? So let's look at a couple examples of invasive species particular to North Carolina. Okay. This first one is a plant, the kudzu vine. The kudzu vine. The vine that covered the South. Oh, it says it right there. Haha. So, originally this plant is native to, like, Eastern Asia, Japan, China, that type of region. And it was brought over in the 1930s to prevent soil erosion. Because remember, plants reduce soil erosion because they hold on to it, because they cover it. And people just thought it looked nice. And the thing with kudzu is once it gets established, once it gets a good root system going and it's established, it can grow a few feet a day in ideal conditions. And you might be like, well, why is that an issue? Like, it's just a plant, right? Well, the problem is it's a vine. Vines grow on things. So a vine is almost like a parasitic plant because it takes away a resource from other plants. So here we have like a house and like trees around it. All these trees that are under the kudzu, they can't get the sunlight anymore. The kudzu is stealing the sunlight from the trees. And without sunlight, remember, plants can't make their own food and they can't eat, and that's a problem. All right. Here's one that's really close to home. If you've ever fished on Lake Norman, maybe you've seen these. The white perch. So white perches, they are actually native off the Atlantic coast around the estuaries. Remember, estuary is that wetland where the fresh and the saltwater meet. And for some reason, these little buggers found their way into Lake Norman. And the most probable cause is somebody who is fishing off the Atlantic coast. We're like, oh, I like catching these fish. Let me bring them back home so I can like fish for them all the time. These are predatory fish, so they eat baby fish and other small fish thingies. And they've totally thrown off the balance of the fish populations within Lake Norman. All right, white perch. White perch is one of these fish if you do go fishing on Lake Norman. So generally the rule of fishing, unless you're like eating something, is generally catch and release. You catch it, you take a picture with it, you throw it back. White perch, you don't have to do that. They don't care what you do with it. They actually prefer you not put it back because it messes up the ecosystem. All right, and our last example that we'll look at, also a fish. All right, the lionfish. The lionfish. So lionfishes, maybe you've seen them in an aquarium. They're these really, really gorgeous fish. They're pretty big, like about the size of a football, with these little spiky spike things. These little spiky spikes are venomous, which means it's really hard for predators to control the lionfish population. So these bad boys are native to the Pacific and Indian Ocean. But recently they've started establishing populations around the Bahamas, and they've kind of working their way up the East Coast. And again, these have been introduced mainly by people letting them go. Okay, so they're former pets. People take them. They don't realize like they're a lot of work. They're a big commitment. So they're like, well, I'll just take them down to Florida, let them go in the warm water, and they'll be fine. These fishies, though, are so good at hunting, all right? They're eating so many of the native fish that they're actually becoming obese. The lionfish are. Okay, so this is one lionfish that's been caught, and they cut open its belly, and like, this is how many little fish were inside of it. Okay, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 21. 21 fish it had just eaten. So you can imagine how many hundreds, maybe thousands of fishies that this one fish had consumed over its lifetime. All right, so invasive species. Why is it an issue? It's an issue because populations of invasive species grow exponentially faster. So most of the time in an ecosystem, all the populations kind of stay the same. All right, you never have too much fluctuation. Invasive species, you start out with very, very few and you get a whole bunch really, really fast. So here's like the thing with the fire ants. So here's the fire ants. Oh, I apologize. They came in around Alabama. Good old Alabama. I love it. No, not really. So why do they grow so fast? How do you go from a population of 100 to hundreds of millions? How do you do that? Well, it's because invasive species outcompete native species. They outcompete it for food and space. All right? And oftentimes, invasive species don't have natural predators. So let's go back to an example of the cane toad. So you remember I said that cane toad, it has a poison? So the reason it has a poison is because in its native habitat, it has predators. All right, so the poison is there to kind of ward it off, but the predators in the native habitat are getting used to it. Okay, that's how evolution be working. Okay, it's kind of like an arms race of who can outcompete of predators and prey. You know, whatever. Well, the cane toad, now that it's in Australia, there's no predator in Australia that's capable of eating a cane toad. So there's nothing to control the population. All right? Same with like the Burmese pythons in Florida. Okay, that big snake, it was eating an alligator. Alligators are kind of the top dog predator in the Florida Everglades. So if pythons are eating the alligators, you're not going to be able to control that population. Why this is bad. When invasive species outcompete native species, they reduce the biodiversity. So let's go back to the cane toad example. Okay, cane toads can eat small mammals like mice, they can eat bugs, fish, small reptiles, a whole bunch of different things. Okay, if they're constantly eating everything, and they're eating up the food that all the other species would eat, eventually the cane toads are going to be the only ones that's left. And that's not a good thing. Remember, yesterday you should have looked in your notes with biodiversity. The more biodiversity you have, the more types of things you have, the healthier that ecosystem is. Because remember, an ecosystem is kind of like a block of Jenga, or a tower of Jenga blocks. Blech, there we go. All right, the more blocks you have, the more stable it is. But if you start taking out a whole bunch of blocks, it becomes unstable and it can fall. All right, so what can I do? What can you do? What can you do, student? Well, you can do a lot of things. Again, most of the time, invasive species are caused by human action. So don't release a non-native species. That makes sense. If you're releasing an animal or plant for pest control, do some research. So ladybugs are something you can get. Ladybugs technically are non-native. So ladybugs come from Asia, but they're not counted as invasive because ladybugs, instead of overtaking an ecosystem and kind of taking over everything, they've kind of found their own little space to fit in. So they kind of like assimilated almost. You can think of it like that. But using native pest control as opposed to bringing something in to control animal populations. It's always easier to prevent something than to try to get rid of something. So it's like that old saying, what is it? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Something like that. I don't know. But once you have a species like overtaking an ecosystem, it gets super, super hard to control. So an example, and this is the last story I'll leave you off with, is New Zealand. So New Zealand's a super interesting place. It's an island nation that broke off of Gondwanaland, which is one of the parts of Pangaea, something like 200 million years ago. I could be wrong in that number. I'm not 1,000% sure, but it's a long time ago. It's been isolated for a super long time. And because it is so isolated, there are actually no native mammals, like mice or whatever, like squirrels. There's no squirrels in New Zealand. Like, they just don't exist. So mammals first showed up on New Zealand about 800 years ago when people, the Maori, settled. And one of the things that they brought along with them were rats. All right, so they ended up having a whole bunch of rats on this island. So they're like, well, we need to get rid of the rats. So what are we gonna do? And they're like, you know what eats rats? Cats. Brilliant, right? So they're like, well, we'll bring in cats and it'll take care of the rat problem, right? The problem with this is that the cats are now an invasive species. Okay, so again, New Zealand, fairly small geographic area. Most of the native animals in New Zealand are birds. This is a kiwi, actually. Isn't it cute? This is a kiwi. This is a national bird of New Zealand. It's kind of dorky looking, but I love it. Kiwis live on the ground. They are flightless, hence why they look like a cotton ball. But New Zealand has a lot of birds and reptiles and amphibians, things that stay on the ground. So kitty cats have been brought to New Zealand to take care of the mice problem. Well, they took care of the mouse problem, but now they're eating all the birds. They're eating all the kiwis. They're eating all the little lizards and the froggy frogs that live there, because that's what cats do. Cats are exceptionally prolific hunters. As I watch my cat sleeping on the sofa, being super lazy. Right? Wonderful animals. So New Zealand has actually gone to a very extreme step, and that's what this article is linked to. You may read it at your leisure. But it says town in New Zealand, and they're like, yo, cats are such a problem that we're going to just have to get rid of all of them. And you might be like, oh, that's terrible if you're a cat person like me. All right? So what they're doing is there's a rule there. If you have a pet kitty cat, you're allowed to have a pet kitty cat, but the kitty cat has to live inside 100% of the time, which is safer for the kitty cat. Your kitty cat has to be spayed or neutered, so it can't have kittens. Your cat has to have a microchip on it, so if it gets lost, they can get it back to you. And once your kitty cat has passed away and crossed the Rainbow Bridge, you can't get another one, all right? Because their goal is to try to help the native populations of birds and reptiles and amphibians and things like that recover, all right, so they don't have one species dominating their ecosystem. So a lot easier to just prevent the invasive species than to try to get rid of them after the fact. Okay, so that's invasive species. Please go ahead and get started on that assignment so you don't have any work to do over Thanksgiving. Last thing, in the announcement about final, I also did post part of the study guide. I'm going to do it in 2 parts. So part 1 covers like the first half of this semester. Part 2 will cover the second half. I'll get that to you as soon as, probably right before the Thanksgiving break ends. But let me know if you have any questions, and I will hopefully get to talk to y'all very soon. If I don't get to talk to you before then, I hope you have a very happy and very safe Thanksgiving. Take care of yourself. Bye.